So selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs, are often still prescribed, for major depressive disorder and anxiety disorders. And their mechanism of action, right, their drug action is to block, to inhibit the selective serotonin reuptake transporter, right, which is expressed in serotonergic neurons, neurons that use serotonin as their primary neurotransmitter, and are utilized to pull the serotonin back out of the cleft after release. And remember, the monoamines, dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin that we've been discussing, are generated in these different cell types: dopaminergic, noradrenergic, and serotonergic. Based on the expression of different synthesizing enzymes. Remember that they're all packaged into vesicles via the same monoamine vesicular transporter that's embedded in the vesicle membranes that would grab any monoamine, dopamine, norepinephrine, or serotonin, right? In a serotonergic neuron, it's being synthesized as serotonin, so that's what that monoamine, vesicular transporter will grab and pack into the vesicles in preparation for release into the cleft. But then the removal mechanisms are selective, in the presynaptic membranes of these monoaminergic, synapses. So, there's a selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor, in a noradrenergic synapse that's expressed in the presynaptic membrane that just would pull in norepinephrine out of the cleft. There's a selective dopamine reuptake, transporter that'll just pull dopamine out of the dopaminergic synapse cleft, right? And the same is true for serotonin. Serotonin is released, typically on the arrival of an action potential, and then it is removed from the cleft by a selective presynaptic, reuptake transporter that utilizes ATP to pull the serotonin from the synaptic cleft, the gap, right, back into the axon terminal. And then, of course, it is broken down by an enzyme called monoamine oxidase, which will, break down any of the monoamines, dopamine, norepinephrine, or serotonin. And in fact, some of the early drugs that were utilized, and they're still utilized to some extent, to treat major depressive disorder, actually targeted MAO, the degradative enzyme inside the axon terminals of dopaminergic, noradrenergic, and serotonergic, neurons. Because if you inhibited that breakdown enzyme, you would allow for more monoamines, right? There would be increased availability and packaging in vesicles, and thus release and activity at synapses for dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin. SSRIs are more selective, right? Just for the serotonin synapses. There are combination drugs that actually also include, dopamine action. That's often because when people, receive an SSRI initially, there's no immediate sort of an effect. Actually, there's some really fascinating research on why, most of these antidepressants, these SSRIs in particular, take a while before there's any kind of reported effect on mood, for example, and on the symptoms of depression. And it suggests, obviously, that there has to be some kind of synaptic changes occurring to underlie, improvements in symptoms, relief of symptoms. And this is not something that's happening sort of immediately. We'll see that, with dopamine, there's stimulation immediately at dopamine, there's an immediate, increase in motivation, mood, and movement. However, serotonin, not so much. So sometimes they combine, these two drugs that can have these two mechanisms, so you get more of an immediate effect. But in general, SSRIs seem to take some time. So there's there are changes that are probably occurring in the distribution of these, 15 subtypes of receptor, at these individual serotonergic synapses with, regular use and exposure to the drug. There's going to be adaptations, down regulations, up regulations of various receptors. There's also some fascinating work on how, enhanced serotonergic transmission is linked to neurogenesis, literally the generation, the division of new neurons. You get new brain cells that may also be a component of this, relief from some of these major depressive symptoms that people, sometimes report. And I have some references up here too about the complexity here because not all these drugs are not effective for everybody, and sometimes they're not very well tolerated. By many. Most serotonin is actually found in the gut too, so there's significant gastrointestinal effects that can occur with exposure to these drugs that are very unpleasant potentially. And I'm just going to read a line. This is from a recent paper about the efficacy and safety of SSRIs and other related drugs in children and adolescents in particular, compared with placebo. They say the authors conclude this is a review. SSRIs and SNRIs, that's selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, are more beneficial than placebo. However, the benefit is small and very disorder specific. I added very, and disorder specific, yielding a larger drug placebo difference for anxiety disorders than for other conditions. Response to placebo is large. That's the other thing. If you're getting therapeutic intervention, if somebody's giving you something, whether it's a placebo, a sugar pill, or an actual SSRI, that placebo has a huge effect. That intervention, that therapeutic care, that engagement with others who are trying to help and assist and listen and provide some support is huge in terms of these potential symptoms. They say response to placebo is large, especially in depressive disorders. Severe adverse events are significantly more common with SSRIs and SNRIs than placebo. So these are just some things to keep in mind here about these drugs that have become very popular.